When an institution or the government or society decides that it's not important to support history education, when they decide to cut history faculty, to cut down the number of history courses taught, when they decide to eliminate programming for history, when they decide to cut funding to museums and libraries, we have decided that the story of veterans is not important. When education cuts are made at the state or federal level, usually the humanities and history are on the chopping block. And often, history courses have told the stories of marginalized people. And recently, that has become politically unpopular. And unfortunately, at least in this country, in the United States, we have marginalized those who serve and those who continue to serve. In my history classes, we talk a lot about wars and conflict. They're a big part of American history, and it's important to tell those stories, and it's important for us to get the point of view from the soldiers who served. In my U.S. History 2 course, we usually read The Good War by Studs Terkel, as well as columns by Ernie Pyle, including The Death of Captain Waskow. We've talked about the terrors and horrors our soldiers faced during World War I. And then many of these World War I veterans then came back home and protested as part of the bonus army during the Great Depression. And then they were attacked by their own government. They were gassed, and their temporary housing was burned down. But I guess we don't want to tell that story anymore because it doesn't put our country and it doesn't put our government in the best light. In my U.S. History 2 class, we also talk about the importance of interviewing people and learning more about historical events from that primary source perspective. So I have students go out and interview friends or family members who've been a part of a historical event or a witness to a historical event. And when these students come back to class and report what they found, they get a lot of stories from their family members who had served, who were veterans. And a lot of these stories have not been told before, even within the families. My students have not heard these stories before. And so now those stories have been shared with a family. And if we're lucky, those stories are then preserved for that family. So that's been one of the better assignments that I've used over the years. In my U.S. History 1 class, we read the last letter of Major Sullivan Ballou before he was killed at the first battle of Bull Run in the Civil War. We talked about the horrendous death toll of the Civil War and what that experience was like for the soldiers who fought in the war and those who survived the war, and how they had to put up with horrendous physical injuries and the emotional toll that took on them for the rest of their lives. And we talk about how this nation paid a terrible price for the original sin of slavery. I've had a lot of veterans in my courses over the years, some as guests and visitors who come in to talk about their experiences, but I've had a lot of students who have served. And they usually served in Iraq or Afghanistan. Um, and I've found that they are glad to have an opportunity to share their stories. That their stories are important to them, and it's important for them to let their colleagues, their fellow students, know that the reality is not the same as you see on TV or get in the media, and that the news and the textbook usually don't get it right. And so they're glad to have an opportunity to share those stories. And so I actually have students at the moment who have served and are sharing their experiences about um, what serving overseas was like. And those students too who have been veterans, even if they're veterans of a more recent war like Iraq or Afghanistan, they can kind of open our eyes to what service like might have been for somebody who served in World War II or World War One or Korea, or another war from longer ago. To be sure, much of our history is not pretty. It's uncomfortable. I think this is why some politicians, some policymaker chose to axe programs in the humanities and history. These programs are also less connected to STEM education and workforce development, which education seems to be really emphasizing right now. But in my humble opinion, they are necessary for us to have a well-informed citizenry. In the end, history is not the most important subject. In my opinion, it's the only subject. But history is about telling uncomfortable stories. This includes slavery, the horrific treatment of American Indians, and the cycle of poverty that their descendants still face to this day, as well as lack of opportunities. But if you choose not to tell the story at all, you're also taking away an opportunity um, to tell about how we overcame injustice, whether individually or collectively, to tell about the victories. So if you take away an opportunity to talk about history, we won't be able to talk about the history of the Navajo Code Talkers, or the history of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment from the Civil War, or the Vietnam veterans who came back and protested against the Vietnam War. If you favor getting rid of history programs and eliminating history faculty, you are choosing to ignore the horrors of Korea and Vietnam. We are choosing to ignore how we poisoned our own soldiers with Agent Orange, denied it for decades, and then paid them a pittance for their sickness, for their pain, their suffering, their cancer, and for many of them, their deaths. We're not going to tell the story about how we ignore Vietnam veterans when they came home and how they suffered in silence with PTSD. I guess we don't want to tell that story either because it doesn't put our country and government in the best light. Now we're doing the same for the issue of the burn pits, other health problems that our veterans are coming home with, the lack of services, problems with addiction and homelessness, and how veterans are currently suffering. Many policymakers have claimed that cuts to history and humanities education was in the name of cost cutting, in the name of saving some money. But that's bogus, because most history courses at public institutions, anyway, are taught by adjunct faculty and graduate students. So we're not paying a lot for that. And many humanities programs, including the one I ran, we didn't have hardly any office space, no equipment. We're able to get some grant money. So we operated in the black, we operated in the profit. And a lot of humanities programs do that because they don't require a lot of staffing and don't require a lot of expensive equipment that some of the sciences and engineering programs require. And then when you eliminate graduate programs in history, many of those students who are graduates are working to preserve the stories of veterans. They're recording oral histories from surviving veterans as well as doing service learning projects to help veterans. My own dissertation reflected on how Civil War soldiers were key to building our national pastime in baseball, so it preserved a part of that history. But perhaps most importantly, history, whether it is through classes or learned in libraries or museums, teaches us that we should avoid these foreign calamities. We should avoid war. So we do not have to send another generation of our young men and women out to fight and die in faraway places like Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. If we really want to honor our veterans and the people who are currently serving, we need to tell their stories. And we need to tell those stories accurately. Yes, a lot of our history, it isn't pretty. It isn't comfortable. It isn't glorious. But then again, war isn't pretty. War isn't comfortable. War isn't glorious.